I'm Matt Booker.
I'm Dave Laird.
And I'm Ben Felonies Diamond, a risky and multivalent trade name meant both to connote and to parody the modern health-conscious consumer's sense of vice, indulgence, transgression, sin, vis-a-vis the consumption of a high-calorie corporate snack. Here on the Concavity Show.
Mr. Squishy.
Sweet.
Perfect.
Ben, nice intro lead. That was sick, man. That's from Mr. Squishy by Wallace. Nice ear, Matt. I think I would have guessed Infinite Jest somewhere, I don't know, in like the 300-page range, but it's been a while since I read Mr. Squishy. Welcome, everybody, to episode 76 of Concavity Show. We are here with Ben Felonies Diamond, as you just heard. Ben, great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for taking the time out to do this. Who are you? Tell us a bit about yourself.
I don't know who your other huge fans of the pod are, but I would like to think of myself as like top 5 fanboys of the pod. If I wasn't top 10, I'd be offended, I think.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that. I would put you squarely at least on the top 5. Yeah.
I was trying to think in the days leading up to this how I actually found your podcast in the first place. I think it's because I was trying to find podcasts with Andrew Savage from Parquet Courts, and I might have found your episode with the interview with him. And then obviously there was I'd read Infinite Jest when I was at university, just nothing to do with my course. I was doing a history degree, but just, that was more fun than the history degree. And then I, had an interest ever since. So there was this, so the parts of the Venn diagram were coming together. You got Andrew Savage, you got David Foster Wallace. And then I think I probably went backwards from that and listened to every single episode. Okay, cool. And then here we are.
That's funny. I was a history major as well and an English minor. And like right after I finished my history degree, or like maybe 3 or 4 months after I started reading Infinite Jest, and then I finished it and I was like, damn, I should have done like an English major. Like this was more compelling to me than the history stuff that I just did. So then I eventually like went back to school and did that. So that's funny. Cool.
So Ben, as you can tell, you're in London, you're in the UK, and of particular interest, I think, is that you just got back from an FA Cup match, Arsenal versus Liverpool, and unfortunately, your preferred team did not win that particular match.
Yeah, we're sorry.
But we could geek out on that for a while, because we now get English Premier League soccer on the Peacock network, so we tend to watch quite a bit of it on Saturdays here in the US, Saturday mornings.
That's like NBC affiliate, right?
Right.
Peacocks, right. Baby.
But the other thing about Ben is he, every year for the past several years, sends us like an end of year audio message. Yeah. And it's great because we love the format of asynchronous audio. What else is a podcast but asynchronous audio?
Right.
And so we had said, if you're ever, in the UK, like we should meet up. And we just sort of accelerated that plan by doing it here over the internet. And email is our other form of communication. So it's nice to have this form of communication with you, kind of synchronous audio and video, I should say.
Yeah. And Ben, you always give us great book recommendations. You always have compelling things to say about movie and television and music, and we have like a lot of very similar overlap in the stuff that we like, and we just thought, well, what the hell, let's just get Ben on the show and do the end of year review with Ben, who's been consistently engaging with this great stuff at the end of every year. So here we are. Great to have you on.
So we're going to go through some of the stuff you talked about in your recent audio message to us.
Yeah.
And, our plan is today, Dave and I have been doing this kind of year-end thing for several years. I don't know.
The whole
7,
life of the show,
years,
we've done this every year for 8 years.
A lot of years we've done it, and we're going to try to keep it to our sort of top 5 books. And we might go over that number. We're going to go one by one through some books to talk about. And then for some of our other top films, podcasts, music of the year. That's going to be in our bonus episode for Patreon subscribers.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say if you're not sick of us yet and you want even more Concavity Show content, you can become a Patreon supporter and get our direct links to bonus episodes.
That's right. And Ben, thank you for your Patreon support over the years. We so appreciate you.
I was there from day dot. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I think that serves in my memory too.
DayZ.
You rock.
DayZ. All right. How do you want to start this, Ben? Do you want to go first with
Let's kick it off with Ben. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe the first one on my list is Anything That Moves by Jamie Stewart, who is better known for being the only consistent member of the band Shushu, spelt XIU space XIU.
Yeah. I used to work in a record store, and the album Fabulous Muscles by them came out around that time, and I would always think of that title, and I refer to my own muscles in a fabulous way sometimes. Yeah.
Is that the album cover with the naked guy on the front? With the
I think it's like him and he's doing some kind of dramatic pose. I don't know if he's naked or not. It would make sense.
Okay.
It's called Fabulous Muscles. He's got to show
or
him off.
he's holding a doll, a kind of baby doll. Is that?
Oh, I'm just gonna look it up right now.
Because the reason I ask is because that comes up in the book. So I just thought that was interesting. But
yeah, he's holding like a guinea pig, like a little kitty cat furry animal, like on his shoulder, and his eyes are closed.
It's a different one. It's a different.
He's got a shirt on though. There's no nudity. Okay.
So
tell us about the book. Yeah.
So essentially, the book is a series of autobiographical short stories that are all about Jamie Stewart's sexual experiences, encounters, some sort of, that are nice, and many that kind of go wrong one way or the other, or are horrifying or disgusting. So it doesn't really glamorize sexual acts. It kind of is engaging in this humanistic storytelling of like, look at all the terrible sexual encounters I've had, and I live to tell the tale. And
Right, yeah.
It sort of starts from childhood and like some slightly weird things that happened at the beginning of his childhood, and then it kind of goes all the way through, including like when he was on tour with Shushu and stuff that happened then. And it's very addictive, very Moorish. You read the first couple and you're just like, I'm hooked on. There's always some kind of crazy angle to these remembrances, these kind of short story, and I'd like to think they're all true, or like largely true.
Right. Yeah. You're like, what level of embellishment is involved here, or fiction? But yeah. After your audio message, I went and just went to like Google Books and read like a few chapters that it gives you of this, and there's like some pretty weird and funny, quirky kind of stuff. It's compelling for sure. I'm curious to read the whole thing.
Can we get explicit? You can always censor me later.
Of course.
Sure, yeah.
So there's the thing that sticks in the mind, and maybe this says more about me than about, but he manages to arrange a threesome with him, a friend / girlfriend, and someone else. And he's kind of into the idea of the threesome until they get to the hotel room, and this person undresses, and they have some kind of yeast infection that is like very disgusting and pungent. And the phrase that I will probably never forget is that he refers to a kind of beige fudge that is coming out of this person. And
abject.
He's sort of trying to kind of hold his nerve.
So the threesome doesn't go off as he planned, I guess.
So that I guess gives you a flavor, no pun intended, of just the way things can go in this book.
Wow, that's disgusting. Truly, well done. We had a sex ed teacher in high school who referred to yeast infections as tumbling cauliflower. That was her description of what it's like.
Jesus.
I think tan fudge is like, I don't know which one is more. Sorry, Matt. Your face just went very awry there.
is awful.
Anyways, moving on from that topic.
All right, Dave, what give us one of your books and we'll
All right. Okay. So in my like number 5 slot of the year, and I'll give a little caveat. I've omitted books that we've done full episodes on this year, just because we've given them lots of airtime. So like I won't talk about Lipsky's book or Diego's book, or sorry, even your book, Matt. But I'll have it known that it would be very highly ranked in my year of reading for sure. But
fine,
omitting
sir.
those ones, I would put in the top 5 spot The Passenger / Stella Maris by Cormac McCarthy in my number 5 spot. I would say those books are like one book. You have to read both of them, I think, or it makes sense to read both of them, and neither of them make as much sense without the other. So I'd put that in the number 5 spot. I thought these books were mostly really good. Did you guys get a chance to read these yet?
So it's funny you say that because I've only read Stella Maris. Like I have The Passenger.
Oh, interesting.
As well.
Okay. Yeah.
And I liked, what I've read of Stella Maris. It's really like just two people talking.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a woman and her therapist in this institution. And, they get into all kinds of discussions about life and mental health, but also like theoretical physics.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very much like Cormac McCarthy being Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah.
And so
sure.
I felt like some of the stuff that he had both characters saying was like just really Cormac McCarthy putting his voice in there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
They're
which is fine.
For him.
Yeah, which is fine. But I definitely highlighted some passages in my book where I was like, okay, this is really just Cormac McCarthy wanted to talk about physics.
Right. Yeah. Or like really expensive violins.
Right. Yeah. And I loved all of that stuff.
Yeah.
I thought it was really good. But that setup, that simple kind of setup, he's like, we didn't know if we'd get more books out of him, right?
Yeah.
So like the fact that these two books I think had been written, a while ago, and he worked on them for a long time, maybe they turned out really good though. The one I've read, like I say, tell us more about The Passenger, I guess.
I'm really curious to know like what it would feel like to read just Stella Maris without the context of The Passenger. I feel like it would be really confusing because you have like nothing to go on. Whereas if you read The Passenger, you know exactly who those two characters are. You know like a lot about particularly the sister's story and her relation to her brother, who's the main protagonist in The Passenger. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess you could read them in either order, but I think The Passenger is probably meant to be read first. Would be my instinct. Came out first, right?
I didn't know any of this, and I thought it was fine. Like I didn't feel lost or confused about anything. I felt pretty well understood.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's cool. There's some weird stuff about, speaking of like weird sexual encounters, there's some weird stuff about incest in these books, which is like, I'm curious about why McCarthy wanted to write about that, just like from a psychological perspective. But there are elements of The Passenger that I really disliked. There's a particular character that relates to the sister character that you would have read about that I found to be just like really obnoxious, and I like disliked all the sections that featured this character. It's kind of like a hallucination that she has consistently throughout the book. But the parts that were about the main character and his life as like a rescue diver, like he does like deep dives into like helicopter crashes and like recovers like black boxes and stuff like that. All the stuff about his life in New Orleans I thought was really compelling, and the prose stuff from McCarthy is obviously just like knockout good. So I quite liked that pair of books, but I didn't think they were perfect, but I quite enjoyed them overall.
Great. So Ben's first book was Anything That Moves by Jamie Stewart. And Ben, remind us, how's Jamie spelled? How is that spelled?
Jamie.
Okay. So I don't know this band, unlike Dave, Shoo. Like,
they're pretty strange.
I'm not a big music person, believe it or not. But and then Stella Maris / The Passenger. I think that's fair to count that as one book.
I think so too. They come in like a slipcover together.
Yeah, they were packaged together and everything. Yeah. My number 5, I should say my list is just all books from 2023.
Oh, that's cool.
Which usually doesn't happen for me. Mm-hmm. Like I've read a bunch of other stuff this year.
Yeah.
But I also read a bunch of new stuff. So I'm going to talk about that. and my list is kind of ranked. I am also, like you, Dave, excluding books that we talked about on the show.
Yeah.
So my number 5 is the new book from Tim O'Brien, which is called America Fantastica. And I got this book at the Texas Book Festival this year because he was there. And it's maybe not something I would have picked up, but I read the description and I was like, oh, this sounds like pretty straightforward, like crime novel.
Oh yeah.
And it is. Like, I would compare it to something like a 70s Elmore Leonard novel, or even something like Tarantino film, and that it's very, accessible. It's not even super literary. Like I say, it's got some literary elements to it, but it's really like a page turner of a guy who's on the loose, robs a bank. Is he going to get caught? What is he doing with his life? And then you get more into his backstory and this woman that he sort of kidnaps, but no one's really looking for her either. So it's like, what do they do if they're on the loose and they're like, the bank doesn't even report it? It's a long story, but I really liked it. It's a long book too. Like, for a book like that, normally those are like solid 300 page and you're out. And this is more like maybe like 450. So it really goes down some tangents and rabbit holes. Some of it, like, they drive from California into Mexico, and I just really enjoyed it. And like I say, not something I would have normally picked up, but I really liked, some of Tim O'Brien's other books.
Oh, cool.
And
sometimes you just need like a romp,
Yeah, this was very much like a page turn. Like, I didn't feel like I was doing work to read it. But he deceives you with that. Like, it is well constructed.
Cool.
America Fantastica. So
did you get to meet him at the book festival or talk to him?
I did.
Like that? You did?
I did. I was actually last in line. He was signing books and he was just about to leave, and I caught him right at the end of the signing line, and we got to chat for a few seconds, and it was really nice. Signed my book. So, all right. So back to Ben. Ben, give us another one of your top books.
Okay. I'm going to go with a book called Porn, an Oral History by Polly Barton.
Wow. Nice subtitle.
It's a really good subtitle. I think some people have felt like they were slightly misled by that, because it's not like, I think your instinct when you see that title is like, it's going to be a history of like Pornhub and Silicon Valley and like that kind of porn oral history with like an insider account of the industry. But it's not that at all. What it actually is a series of anonymized interviews, maybe in the Studs Terkel kind of tradition. I've never read any Studs Terkel, but I feel like it would be, in that vein, and maybe Svetlana Alexievich as well, that kind of thing. And she's speaking to, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, she put out an email to various people in her contact list and said, I want to interview people about their relationship with porn and their history, like, their entire history of how they, when they first watched whatever their first pornographic material, and what it was, and how that's changed over the years, and do they keep it from their partners, or do they sort of watch it with their partners, and all that kind of stuff. So she knows these people, they're people, colleagues, friends, whatever, but the interviews are anonymized in the book itself. So I think there's about 20 interviews, and it's really, really good. And it's she kind of says in her introduction, if I recall, that she didn't really expect herself to be writing this book, and you sense throughout the interviews that she's had to get over her own embarrassment of talking about porn, and that in some ways she is repulsed by the idea of porn, because she's a feminist and has seen porn as this kind of, patriarchal, misogynistic venture that she has not really had much to do with necessarily. And she herself, and it crops up in the interviews because it's, it's a back and forth between her and her subjects, that she finds either erotic literature or erotic parts within regular literature to be much more stimulating than any kind of videographic pornography, which to her seems so confected and fake that it's never turned her on. So she's always found that like well written erotic parts in literature have been what worked better for her. But but it's, you know, you couldn't predict what's going to come up in these interviews, because, you know, you pick 20 different people, you're going to have 20 different, you know, random responses to pornography. And you know, there's like an old man talking about, you know, blue movies that were being passed around in kind of clandestine underground cinemas in the 1960s or whatever. And there's, you know, a young man who talks about, you know, the more kind of Pornhub end of the spectrum, and then there's all sorts of things in between, and some incredibly kind of personal and weird and potentially embarrassing things that come up, and including someone who has obviously got a lot of shame around this, and they're really into kind of burping, like burping kind of porn. That's their thing. That's their kink, like videos of people burping. And I don't think they necessarily have to be like naked whilst they're burping, but it's the kind of burp thing that gets them. So that's one of the more fascinating interviews So I have to say, after reading that, I didn't like rush out and try and find like that part of the internet for myself. I was more just interested in it, but I think so.
It's just something for everyone, isn't there, in this age of the internet? Yeah.
I hope my first two choices don't portray me as this kind of, you know, but that's just the way the cookie crumbled this year.
But yeah, I told you I'd read there's a lengthy review of this book in the New York Review of Books, and that's how I came upon it and discovered it. And you know, there is an old like cliche back in the early days of the internet, like all the great advancements in the technologies behind the internet were like invented by like porn websites.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Like the ability to even embed high resolution video, you know, the all of these sort of tongue in cheek, but there's some truth to it. And, you know, there's a famous like cartoon where it's like the size of smartphones and they're going down until people realize they could see porn on the smartphones, and then they keep getting bigger and you know, the iPhone Max. And and you know, I was also thinking when I was reading that review that, you know, there's been you know, a lot of frank conversation, especially in the past like 10 years, I would say, about like a backlash to alcohol, and like a lot of like sober memoirs, and you know, younger people rethinking, you know, the popularity of non-alcoholic cocktails. Like there's been a rise in sort of pushback on a lot of things that maybe previous generations took for granted. And you haven't really seen that with porn in a lot of ways. And that's an interesting, if anything, there's been an explosion, like with God, it's really hard to talk about this without just constant puns and double entendres, but there's been a rise. No, there's been an increase in, like, you know, OnlyFans and creators who are on Instagram, and like the personalization of things. So I think it's a really interesting subject that hasn't gotten a lot of kind of mainstream or academic attention since the 80s, maybe.
If only Wallace's, you know, project that he wanted to do about this subject, like if he was still alive and could write about it now, I bet it would be like a pretty fascinating read.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote a pretty good one with the Big Red Sun. But
so just on the you know, it's interesting that you mentioned the alcohol versus non-alcoholic drinks and pornography, because I picked out just like a one paragraph quote from this to give you a flavor of one of the interviews, and it kind of covers both of those. So this is just something someone said, so they're actually talking about someone else they know, but they just say, "A friend of mine, my cousin, stopped drinking alcohol, but he didn't tell me that. We went out to a bar in Soho and he ordered a bottle of vodka. I didn't know he was in AA at that time. He made me drink a bottle of vodka in front of him so that he could get kind of a thrill from it. I said, 'So what do you do now that you don't drink or smoke? How do you get your kicks?' To which he replied, 'I have my white noise. For 3 hours before I go to bed, I watch the most violent pornography I can find. I don't masturbate. I don't even feel anything. I just watch it, and I don't think about anything.' hearing that, I thought, my God, man, have a vodka.
Yeah, right. Holy shit.
Wow.
That's nuts.
Yeah, that
3
is
hours?
shit.
God, it's like a Martin Scorsese marathon.
And that reminds me, I think I've mentioned this on the show already, but it's so good I'm going to have to repeat it, which is at the conference in Gettysburg last year. One of the presenters, Maita, put up this quote from a tweet from a writer named Carlos Busqued, and it said something like, "There is nothing more dangerous than a person who does not need an addiction to soften their relationship to the world, for such a person is as hideous as the world itself." And it's sort of saying, like, there are people who are addicted to like quitting addictions just as much as they are addicted to the substance or the
That's
thing
so
in
meta,
question
hey?
themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's interesting. Like Wallace himself, said he was addicted to television, which is itself is a type of like voyeurism he compares it to.
Yeah.
So super interesting. And
That's
and I
almost like
like,
a quote that would come out of the Netanyahus section in
yeah,
Infinite Jest, right? Like
yeah,
all the things that you can become addicted to. Yeah.
yeah.
Crazy.
All right, so Dave, you're up next.
Yeah, I got number 4 for me this year. I would say would be Magnetic Fields by Ron Loewinsohn. It's a book I know Matt really likes, and Adam Levin recommended this book to us like years ago, I think, when we had him on the first time.
Yeah.
Speaking of erotic literature, this book has quite a few erotic scenes in it.
I mean, does it? It has a couple.
There's a couple. There's a couple of parts that stand out in my memory. There's like a university professor who eventually has a relationship with a student, and they have some pretty saucy bits. But this is kind of like the book that you described, Matt. It's like a book about like robbery off the start. So it follows a character who's like just a low level like B&E guy, and he just like breaks into houses, and he's not really that interested in like stealing stuff as much as he is as just being in like the sacred space of others, and he kind of like gets a kick out of that. He steals like weird little like trinkets and like keepsake type things, and the book goes from there, but that's kind of the starting narrator. And this book is cool. I liked it a lot. It's from like 85, 84, 85, I think.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's like
maybe
right
even
around the time
83.
of White Noise, or like just before White Noise. Yeah. And I know you're a big fan of this one, Matt, as well.
Yeah, so this is turned into one of my favorite books of all time, and I'm glad I got you to read it this year. And it's got an interesting structure, and that the first section is 45 pages, the middle section is 90 pages, and the final section is 45 pages.
I did not notice that.
A couple of other things I've learned about it, or thought about it, Dave, is that some of the book is based on a true story about this child prodigy who is a sort of composer and dies young. That story is real.
That's a real heartbreak moment. Like I've talked about this before on the show, but anything about like the death of children like hits too hard for me at this point because I have 2 young kids. But like
I'm the same way, man. I felt that way with the Tree of Life.
Yeah, that's a good example of this for sure. Yeah.
But what I think interested Ron Loewinsohn about it is the kid in the story is, a prodigy who is also interested in the music Kindertotenlieder, which is like child death music. And it's sort of, sadly ironic that later this child himself dies. And is that Mahler who wrote that? Is it Mahler?
I think
it's Mahler.
That sounds right. I read it pretty early in the year, but that sounds.
And
familiar.
It's a similar thing happened with the composer, who I think was Mahler, is that he had not had a child who died. He wrote that music and then later had a child who died. So it's sort of like this curse of the Kindertotenlieder. The other thing I would say, Dave, I don't know if you noticed this, but like you described the burglar, Jerome, or I think it's Albert or Jerome. This guy's breaking and entering. He breaks into a home where there is a train set in a room.
Yeah.
But that part of the book is described as being in the San Francisco Bay Area. But then in the second section, we meet that kid who has the train room.
Right.
And that is described as being in the Hudson Valley of New York. So it's almost like a dream within a dream section. There's some sort of like, it reads like a realistic novel, but it's not. Like there's some stuff in it that is almost like supernatural. So
Yeah, that's a good
So-
point. I don't think that struck me as much.
it's
but thinking
it's
back,
well
it's good.
integrated into it. But anyways, we could do a whole episode on that book because I love it
it's
so
great.
much.
I liked it a lot.
And our buddy Justin Warsh is big into it right now. I was actually talking to him about this book earlier today. So
No way.
we'll have to maybe get him on the show to talk about magnetic fields as well. So,
Cool.
sorry to just dominate your whole list, but like you brought up one of my favorite books. So
That's great. You had more intelligent things to say about it than I did, as usual. So it's
I don't know about that. Ben, you haven't read this book? You don't know this book?
Haven't read it, but obviously being fanboy somewhere between number 1 to number 5 of the podcast, I do remember the Adam Levin talking about it on that episode, and I have a copy in an ever increasingly large stack of books.
Yes. Okay.
And if there's one thing I've learned, and this is a warning to listeners, if there's one thing I've learned about books, is that particularly with books that aren't really in print anymore, but are like perhaps cheap on Aid Books or secondhand, buy it when you can. If you have the funds available, buy it when you can, because it won't always be cheap. And then you'll kick yourself when it's on eBay for like 500 quid because they haven't, for some reason there's an issue. It's not being reissued, for various reasons. And you're like, why the hell didn't I buy it when it was like £10 on Aid Books? So I have got a copy.
Right.
And I've bumped it up. I've put an asterisk.
Specifically?
I'm trying to think. You know what? Actually, not to like be smug about it, but it's happened in reverse, where I've looked at prices after I've bought things and gone, "Thank God I did buy that when I did." Yeah.
I found this book to be kind of hard to track down. I mean, I found it through like Amazon.com, which is like the easiest way to find a book for American people. For Canadian people, it's a pain in the ass because it's not on Amazon.ca, but it's on Amazon.com. So you got to pay for like way higher shipping because it's coming from the US. I ended up getting it shipped to a friend who lives in Portland, and I met up with her in Seattle in February. So she brought it to me. But I couldn't find it anywhere else, like not in the library. No bookstores had it, or even like in their system. So is kind of easy, but sort of also weird to find this book.
And I think I've mentioned this before, but there's a band, Magnetic Fields, obviously.
That's right. Yeah.
But they take their name.
Songs.
They take their name from the Andre Breton book, Magnetic Fields, which came out in like the 1920s. And it's sort of a surrealistic, like prose poetry masterpiece. There are, I think, a few connections to Loewinsohn's book that he does take thematically from that book, but they're pretty tenuous. And it's a very bizarre book to read. I like Andre Breton a lot, but that book is not meant to be read like literally.
Okay.
Magnetic Fields.
Cool. How about you, Matt? You got a number 4 for us?
So my number 4 is The Deluge by Stephen Markley, which is a big 700-page novel about climate and dystopian climate disaster.
Yeah.
And this is a book that I'm kind of cheating in that I moderated this panel at the Texas Book Festival this year. It was actually supposed to be 2 books, The New Earth by Jess Rowe. Jess Rowe dropped out kind of at the last minute, but I did read The New Earth by Jess Rowe as well, which is mostly about a family coming together for a wedding, and there's sort of dysfunctional family members, one of whom is killed in Palestine by an Israeli sniper. So very much of the moment if you want to read The New Earth by Jess Rowe. But The Deluge by Stephen Markley has got a lot of actual science in it. And it's sort of large cast of characters, one of whom is a climate scientist, one of whom sort of works in Washington in politics. And so you get a lot of, stories that like, how does a writer take what is probably the most important issue of our times and sort of illustrate that as an urgency thing. And it's not that like, oh, the penguins are all going to die. It's more like you and your family members are going to be affected by this, and here's what that will look like. And so that, I thought it was very effective at sort of personalizing that, where you actually see stories of people who are affected by disasters, which is what we see all the time, and they're sort of written off as isolated incidents or not connected to sort of broader cause. And then, getting to meet Markley was great, and talk to him. One thing I learned, a lot of the political stuff in it about passing legislation and things is inspired by true events and the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which actually is, weirdly named the IRA, but
Oh, really?
is really named that to pass, and it's full of climate mitigation like projects, like maybe the greatest of our generation. It's sort of unknown in popular press how much that actually had to do with renewable energy and incentives for electric vehicles and all kinds of really popular things were passed in that act. So that was a learning point for me. And it got a ton of press. I mean, the guy was on like the Seth Meyers show and a lot of TV stuff. So
I read a book this year that sounds quite similar to that, The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson.
Yeah, we talked about that a bit with David Lipsky, I believe.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Sheila mentioned him too.
Right.
Cool.
So that's my number 4. I'm going to pass it back to Ben.
Back to Ben.
Okay, so I think I'm going to go for a novella called Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. Who Dave, I know we had a bit of a back and forth via email about Claire Keegan, so I know there's at least one other Keegan
her new
fan
collection.
So you'll have to tell me what you think about that. But so this,
Definitely.
for people who don't know, this was I think it was longlisted, possibly also shortlisted for the Booker Prize last year or the year before. So that's when it came onto people's radars, and it's about the Magdalen laundry scandal in Ireland, which went on for many decades, and was basically there are many elements to it, but my understanding of it is that sort of disgraced women who had become pregnant and weren't married were sort of taken in by the Catholic Church, and they had to do forced labor in these laundries, and so the laundry kind of made money for the church as an institution by doing this laundry work for the community. People kind of knew what was going on, but because of the restrictive nature of the society and sort of code of silence around the Catholic Church, that people didn't, they knew what was going on, or perhaps they didn't, but it definitely wasn't talked about or challenged. There was an exceptionally high rate of child death when the babies were born in the Magdalen laundries, because I think they often didn't call a doctor when a doctor was needed and things like that. So it was this giant scandal in Ireland, which I think maybe Enda Kenny, or the president of Ireland, only apologized for it formally acknowledged it. The kind of head of state only acknowledged it in the 2000s, I think. And it's not directly told from the perspective of a woman in the laundry itself. It's a small business owner who has a kind of firewood business, who is it's set at Christmas time, and he's providing firewood for the local community and going around making deliveries, and he happens to stumble upon, when delivering firewood to the church, he sees a woman locked up in a kind of shed, and is kind of shocked by what he sees, and he is sent into a kind of crisis where he is deciding what to do, whether to intervene. His wife wants him to keep quiet because his children will be affected if he kicks up a fuss, because the church the church has the kind of best schools in the area, and the children might be denied access to those schools if he complains and all that. And he also was some kind of child that was born out of wedlock in, quote unquote, shameful circumstances himself. So he's got a complex relationship with that kind of stuff. And she just really packs in like a huge amount into a 100-page novella. And the language is quite spare. It's not complicated or difficult language. And it is very moving and thought-provoking. And yeah, Dave, you'll have to tell me about her short story collection that you read as well. But I would thoroughly recommend this novella.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds good. Rachel is obsessed with that book, and she keeps telling me like, read this book, and I'm like, yeah, I'll get to it. So I'm bumping it up even more than it already was. But She Got So Late in the Day by Claire Keegan for Christmas this year. It's a really small book with 3 longer short stories in it, and I read it on like, I don't know, Boxing Day and the day after, like 2 sittings. It was over. I thought it was wonderful. It's the first thing I've read by her, and yeah, really really lo-fi kind of prose, but she captures a lot of dense stuff in her writing in a very short amount of time. And I kind of felt like I was reading like a 19th century Russian literature, something like Chekhov or something, is sort of what it felt like to read her work. So yeah, she's fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to getting into that one.
And did you pick this up, Ben, because you were a fan of her other stuff, or was it just kind of happenstance that you picked it up?
I've never read any of her other stuff, and a friend of mine bought me a copy as a present, and and it was on his recommendation. And
Oh, nice.
I think I was on a train ride to Devon, and it's classic train ride fare, because it's like I can probably read this, but before I get off at Exeter St
Yeah,
David
that's good.
Station, yeah. So
Feel so
yeah.
accomplished, I just read a book. Yeah. It's cool. Awesome. What's her other? She has another major book. Do you remember what it's called? I can't remember.
Ooh. She just released in what could potentially be seen as a bit of a publishing cash grab, like one short story in like small hardback format for like the Christmas market or whatever, and it was called So Late in the Day, I think it was called. So that just came out.
Yeah, that's the one that I just read.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
But it's worth it. It's worthwhile.
I
Oh,
saw it at the
Foster is
shelf
the other one by her. Yeah,
because they're so small.
Yeah.
I actually, as you know, like tiny books. So
yeah,
I think that's actually one of the appeals of it. It's not
totally.
400 pages.
I had just come out of reading like a 770-page book right before that, Sun House by David James Duncan. And it took me like from August until December to finish. It was just like kind of a slog. I read a couple of books like in the midst of that too, but then to just read one book in like an hour and a half felt really lovely.
Is that a segue to your next one? Because I assumed you were going to talk about Sun House.
It's actually not a segue. I put that in my kind of honorable mentions.
Okay.
Like I just wanted to mention that I read this book because he's one of my more favorite writers historically. He's got a book called The Brothers K that's like a top 5 Legend, novel of all time for me. And this book was 29 years in the making since The Brothers K, which came out in the early 90s. So it's been like, whoa, David James Duncan's coming out with a novel finally. This is a lot of excitement, and David Peach was the editor on it. So like
Michael Peach.
Sorry, and Michael Peach was the editor on it. And so like I was very excited to read this, and I would say overall I would give this book like a 7 out of 10. It has some really great characters and really great moments, but overall I felt myself being quite often annoyed by like the over earnestness of some of the other characters. It felt kind of like saccharine, sappy in a lot of ways, and like very, very heavy handed with some of the religiosity stuff in it, spirituality stuff. So that was a kind of a hit and miss book for me. So I wouldn't put it in my top 5, but I did spend a lot of time with it this year. That's for sure. There's actually a listener of the show who's in Victoria, and he was posting about it on Instagram, and we had some back and forth, and we're going to try and meet up for like a book beer soon and talk about Sun House and other things. But yeah. We're in 3s now. My number 3 this year would probably be The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty. Mm-hmm. This book won the National Book Award last year, and I found it to be really radical. It's a great book about a young woman who is like into kind of like Christian mystic women, the Beguines, I guess they're called, and it's like a very strange story about her living with some other teenage kids who have come out of the foster system, and like the weird stuff that happens in their story together. There's some stuff about her and a high school teacher having like a romantic relationship, and there's a very kind of like foregrounded climax of the book that we see on like page 1, but so the whole story is kind of like unraveling that sort of mention of like what happens at the end. I think Tess Gunty's prose is fantastic. Like I was just jaw dropping a lot at like a sentence level of some of the like similes and metaphors that she writes. I know that she's a big Wallace fan. I've heard her talk really extensively about Wallace on other podcasts and things like that. So I would recommend The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty. I thought it was great.
Yeah, I also read this book, and it's not on my list, but I loved it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking actually right before Christmas. I was talking with Stephen Moore about this book,
Oh yeah,
and
cool.
he brought it up to me, saying he had just read it, and he said it struck him as the most Wallacean novel he had read since Wallace's death.
Really?
So that was pretty big praise, I thought.
Yeah.
And, we both thought it was great that a book like this won the National Book Award, which is pretty rare,
Yeah.
that a book that's got, like you said, a lot of weird stuff in it.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel mainstream. And like, if it wins the National Book Award, by definition, it's like mainstream literary fiction.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel mainstream. It feels very much of its own thing. It's got a lot of sort of like how Wallace had like a fictionalized version of Ohio, the Great Ohio Desert in Cleveland, and Broom of the System. She's kind of got that in her book as well, of this fictionalized version of, is it South Bend, Indiana?
Yeah, I think it's Indiana.
South Bend, Indiana. And the park there, and there are rabbits in it, and like kind of eco-terrorism. There's all kinds of stuff going on in this book. And,
it's quite violent. There's like kind of weird occult stuff going on. Like, it's pretty dark, I would say.
But she also did an MFA at NYU with
David Lipsky.
David
one of her
Lipsky.
profs. Yeah, he's thanked in her acknowledgements, right?
So
that's
pretty cool overlap, and I do think it's a fantastic book. I guess I didn't put it on my list because I think it came out like 2 years ago.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And just so happened
maybe
that
it was last year. Yeah, maybe 2021. I know Brandon Hobson was on the selection committee for the National Book Award that year.
Yeah, I think it won in 2022, but
yeah.
Either way, fantastic book, and I would love to talk about it more because there is a lot of detail in it, a lot going on. I have a lot of like sticky notes on it.
Yeah, that tracks. Great.
What are we on, number 3 now?
Number 3 from that.
So my number 3 is a book that came out earlier this year, or in 2023, I should say, called Diana, My Graphic Obsession by Sivan Piatigorsky-Roth. And Sivan is someone who I met at the David Foster Wallace conference this year. And Sivan is a super talented artist, as well as a academic, and his particular interest is in like rabbinical studies and gender, and there's all kinds of philosophy. He did a paper at the conference on sort of LGBTQ issues in Infinite Jest. And I'm summarizing probably way too much here, but the book itself is about his obsession, and he's transmasculine, about Princess Diana and obsession with Princess Diana, and why Princess Diana was and is a sort of LGBTQ icon. And so, like I say, it's a graphic novel, which, I often in these wrap-ups, I have at least one graphic novel on my list. And there's one, Dan Clowes has a new book called Monica, I would mention, but I really like this book by Sivan. I like the art in it. I like anything that's sort of a personal memoir, personal history. And it gets into some stuff which I didn't know a lot about, because I've always had like a weird fascination also with like Princess Diana's death, and like what that brought out in Americans, especially. So the American perspective in something like that, I think is super interesting. And anyone who's I would say interested in Diana at all would love it. And it really is something like, I was talking with Sivan, how like there's a whole community amongst stamp collectors. Like the biggest person who's ever been big on a stamp is like Queen Elizabeth. Like Queen Elizabeth has been on more stamps than like any human being in the world.
That makes sense.
Like because of all the British Empire, Australia, India, and Africa, all over the world, they've got Queen Elizabeth on the stamp. She was there for 70 years.
Yeah, the sun never sets.
But how short Diana's life was. There's a whole community in stamp collectors that are like big into Princess Diana stamps because they sell, and like every country in the world has made like Princess Diana stamps. So it touches like a lot of different communities, like whatever community you're into. There's often like
There's
people
a
who are
subculture
super
within that until
right,
yeah,
super into that.
Yeah.
Like, so anyways, it's interesting to bring this up. I didn't even think in advance of like, oh yeah, we'd be talking to someone in London, but
Yeah, right.
Ben, any thoughts here on the royal family or the death of Queen Elizabeth?
Here come the hot takes.
Princess Diana.
I'm always astounded when, people from far-flung places are, talking about Princess Diana, and I think I remember the day she died. I was
Me
5
too.
or 6 years old, and I went downstairs and I taught myself how to use the TV. This is quite a Wallace style anecdote, but I taught myself how to use the TV because when you're small, you wake up and I think I'd learned that my parents were in bed, so I just go down and watch TV until they wake up because I don't want to wake them up. Went downstairs, turned the TV on. All the kids' cartoons were cancelled because there was just non-stop rolling coverage of Diana's death. And I went upstairs and woke my parents up and said, I think I said something like the Princess of Wales is dead, but that's okay because we don't live in Wales or something. So I hadn't really understood. I hadn't understood that the Princess of Wales was sort of the princess of all of our hearts and the UK and whatever, But and then I think my mum was so shocked she started crying, even though she's not a royalist at all, and it was obviously big news, and so yeah, it was a big deal. And yeah, Matt, so does the book excavate why she's a gay icon? Because I've never quite I know she did work with like AIDS charities, and I think she did something like she held someone's hand who was HIV positive, and that was a really big thing at the time because people were so afraid of that kind of contact with so yeah.
But I think generally she herself was an iconoclast who did not fit in with others, right? Sure. She did not fit in with the royal family, and she was, had this sort of outsider persona. And, it's not like she was a working class person or whatever. She was not, but she was very much of the disposition to be sympathetic to those who were disaffected. And I think that again, I'm simplifying it. Go read Savant's book for a first person point of view. And he really gets into the details on why this is. But it's a very personal thing of, the aesthetics that she had were very unique amongst the royal family. And like I say, her willingness to engage with AIDS patients in the 1980s was just unprecedented. 1990s, that was still not a thing. So anyways, great job by Savant of putting this book together. I hope it gets more attention.
Yeah, that sounds great.
My graphic obsession, Diana, Savant.
I need to get into more graphic novels. It's like a form of literature that I've really not dug into much. I need to do that.
Well, I could send you a whole list.
Okay, awesome.
All right, Ben, you're up next.
Number 2, Ben.
Okay, I'm going to go for Something Happened by Joseph Heller, which is probably, I'd say, his second masterpiece, really, that I think most people read Catch-22 and that's enough Joseph Heller for them. And he's sort of associated with that novel, and there's not much curiosity to kind of scratch beneath the surface and see if he's done anything else of note. And it's been on my to read pile for a long time, and I finally got round to it. It's quite a big novel. It's maybe like 570 pages in my edition. So, and it's a lot of text because it's essentially a dramatic monologue for 570 pages. And it's quite Mad Men-ish in its setup, that there's this kind of mid to high ranking business person who has a very kind of office bound life in, I'm going to say, the 1970s, and there's all sorts of office politics and shenanigans going on. He's very casually admits to having various affairs on the go, and yeah, so it's quite different from Catch-22. It's not it's not a military novel. It's an office novel, really. And
Oh yeah.
So this is so funny. I have to interrupt because I was just reading this book like in the past few days,
Oh really?
and this is so fucking weird. And I love this book because I have a particular interest in like fiction writers who've had office jobs.
Oh yeah.
And have had this kind of same experiences that I've had of having to like have a day job. Most writers do, but like not a lot of them write about it very well, or in a way that I find relatable. Um, and he had worked, as a file clerk before the war, and then was in the war, and then afterwards got this job as a copywriter at an advertising agency. And coincidentally, I learned it was the same advertising agency that the writer Mary Higgins Clark worked at before she became a writer. Just a weird coincidence. A lot of writers go into copywriting, at ad agencies to pay the bills. So it's inevitable that you would work with someone talented uh, in New York. But um, I'm kind of shocked that you brought up this book because not a lot of people talk about this book. I feel like you hear a lot more about Catch 22. So when I finished that book, I went and read the Paris Review interview with him again, which I think, like you said, is like mid 70s, something like that. And he talks about his process of writing is like to come up with a first line. He's like, he has to know the first line of the book and the second line, and then see how far he can go with it before it peters out. And usually has to know the ending line as well. And for this book, do you have it handy? Do you want to read the first line of the book?
Yeah.
Do you have the book in? All right.
Let's go.
The,
Luckily, I do. Yeah.
the first line is phenomenal.
Yeah. I get the willies when I see
Go
closed
ahead.
doors.
How great is that?
That's it. That's funny.
That's
The
great.
willies.
And he talks about he had written another line that ended up later on in the book about other people in the story. But there was a quote in that I highlighted. I wrote down. I copied it down. He says, "I don't have a philosophy of life or a need to organize its progression. My books are not constructed to say anything," which I highly related to that. And that sort of reflected in the title of the book, like something happened. They often said like in the 70s, like nothing happened. And so his was like a retort that like, no, something did happen.
Oh yeah.
Um,
I've never read Catch 22, which is a shameful admission. Which should I start with? Should I read that first or this one?
Oh, Catch 22 is a fucking classic. I mean,
Yeah, well, I know. It's like in my school library, there's like a whole novel set, a class set. Got to do it.
I feel like something happened is the more grown up book though.
Okay.
Like I'm more interested in that now than I was like Catch 22 in my 20s.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Ben, I feel terrible that I'm like, oh, you guys are talking about it, and like you bring up your own book, and now I'm fucking dominating the conversation.
No, that's the beauty of dialogue, isn't it? So we're in dialogue with each other, and so that's lovely. And yeah, I'm delighted that you're also reading it. But have you ever listened to him? Because I put his name in on YouTube. He's a brilliant speaker, and he's gone in the 70s. I think he went round and some smart person in various colleges, like I don't know whether it was like the Students Writers Association of UCLA or something, but they had the smart idea to invite him and also record it for posterity. And he's like a stand-up comic. He's absolutely hilarious. And he's got this brilliant, I don't know, is it a New York accent, a kind of Jewish New York accent? I don't know, but whatever it is, he's got this incredible voice. He's incredibly dry, very funny, and it's just if you kind of if you've got a spare hour, just like, and you haven't already, just look him up because he's brilliant. And there's multiple recordings of him, and they're all worth listening to. And he reads out bits from the novel and stuff. Yeah.
Maybe we'll get a monthly audio newsletter, mostly about nothing podcast about
that's a
Jessica
good
Keller.
idea. That's a damn good idea.
Yeah, thanks.
I am working on another one of those. But,
hey, nice.
That is a great tip. And that thing where I said, he doesn't really have a philosophy of life. He's not really trying to say anything. In a way, that quote and some parts in the book reminded me of like the movie Office Space,
Oh,
and that like
love it.
Peter's dream in Office Space is like, what would you do if you
Do
had
nothing.
It's like, just do nothing.
You don't need
And
$1 million to do nothing.
right, right. But that idea of like, just I would fucking do what I'm doing now, but just without the job. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like, I find it as like a universal desire almost.
Matt, would you agree that
Right.
it's also got very inventive use of brackets in this book? He's a big fan of bracketed
Yeah, that's
asides.
What year was this book about? Do you know?
I think 1974. Says it was first published in the UK.
Okay.
I think the brackets in this as well are genius because I haven't got an example to hand, but it's basically like it's a contradictory secondary monologue to the primary monologue. So it'll be like, I feel bad that my son got sent home from school today. Brackets, I don't, or I don't really. So it's like
Okay.
it's that kind of thing. But I've got just this paragraph I think sums up the kind. He's brilliant at like dissecting office culture. So he says, in the office in which I work, there are 5 people of whom I am afraid. Each of these 5 people is afraid of 4 people, excluding overlaps, for a total of 20. And each of these 20 people is afraid of 6 people, making a total of 120 people who are feared by at least one person. Each of these 120 people is afraid of the other 119, and all of these 145 people are afraid of the 12 men at the top who helped found and build the company and now own and direct it.
yes.
That's great.
That's great. And it reminds me a bit also of Christian Taborda's book, which we talked about before, as
The Apology.
The Apology is an office novel.
Yeah.
Something happened. Anything else on this book, man? There's so much going on in this book that I love. Do you want to anything
Any
else that
other
you can
plugs?
think of? Yeah.
I think it probably has to come with a health warning that it's a deeply cynical novel. Like one of the most cynical things I've ever read.
Oh wow! Do you feel like you're like I don't know, your soul being attacked by it on some level? Like it's like when you watch a lot of Curb Your Enthusiasm, you kind of take a dark view of humanity. At least I do.
They
feel
say
it
when
seeping
you
into your regular thought process.
they say like when you read a book, a good book reads you. I think there is an uncomfortable conversation to be had with yourself when reading this book. Like, am I this? Is he telling me that we're all like this, or is he kind of like a comic over exaggeration of that archetype?
Yeah.
Man, I think I'm just more cynical than you because I felt like it was spot on.
You're like, finally, somebody who gets me. Yeah.
God, maybe I'm too cynical. I mean, it's a good question. Probably I am.
It's also very Freudian in the, I mean, it seems to be a theme of my choices, but there is like this sort of pervading sexual frustration running through it, where he's fixated on this kind of incident in his young adulthood where there's an older woman, I think, in the office when he's a junior young person in the office, and she's kind of giving him the wink and the nod. She's up for a bit of whatever, but he doesn't have the balls to kind of consummate this, thing that is, and he is obsessed. As an older person looking back, he's obsessed at this moment of sexual frustration. So it's got this kind of Freudian frustration running through it as well. Yeah.
Huh. Sounds funny.
All right, Dave, you're
I like
up.
that. Cool. My number 2, which was a book that I was reading. I was like in the middle of reading last year when we recorded this episode, so I talked about it briefly there, but had just sort of gotten into it. It's The Netanyahus by Joshua Cohen, which won the Pulitzer Prize last year. This book is really fun and wonderful, and it kind of chronicles a professor in New York who's like a professor of Jewish studies, and he's at this like small, college or whatever, and like most of the novel is him sort of being groomed by his senior faculty members to like host this visiting scholar who is the title character, so Benjamín Netanyahu's father. who is the current Prime Minister of Israel. So Bibi is in the novel, but he's a child in the book. So it's set in like the 1960s. And it's about this visit from this visiting scholar and his family to this other professor's house. The actual visit is a very small percentage of the book, like the last maybe quarter or fifth. And the first 75% of the book is like the lead up to this like anticipated arrival. And the stuff that happens in the last section of the book is very funny and off the wall and just very ridiculous, and it makes for a really wonderful time reading. So I would recommend it's very kind of sort of apt to the moment that we're in right now with Israel, where if you can satirize and make fun of this person, it probably feels pretty good to do that. And I think it captures that in a way that's pretty fun and interesting. Has anyone had a chance to read this one?
I have not.
Yeah.
I tried.
It's pretty
reading,
quick. It's like 200-ish pages, so it's not a big commitment.
I tried reading his previous book, Wits. I just couldn't get into it.
That was the first thing I read by him, so it's my first experience.
And for listeners who don't know, Dave, you briefly lived in Israel. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, in 2014, we lived in Tel Aviv for 6 months. Rachel was doing her master's like field work in peace and conflict studies at the time, so she was working with a Israeli-Palestinian peace building group that worked with like youth particularly. So we were there.
She's busy right now.
Her current field of work is not in that area. She's more in like the health sector now. But it's certainly been a major topic of discussion in our home recently. We got there, and like 2 days later, the war Operation Protective Edge started. So there were missiles coming to Tel Aviv, 5 missile interceptions a day. I was panicking. I was like Googling flights to Greece. Let's get the hell out of here. And then after like 3 or 4 days, it was like just totally normal. The big air siren go off, and just kind of like roll over in bed and look at each other and be like, "Oh, this will be fine. The Iron Dome will take care of this." Whereas like 3 days before that, I was like freaking out, So it was a really interesting exercise in adaptation for me, like just what you can get used to very quickly as a human being. It was a super interesting place. It's a heartbreaking place in many ways. Obviously, this is like the most extreme form of that we've ever seen, and so a little bit of a personal connection to that.
The Netanyahus.
Dave, am I right in thinking that there are these kind of lecture bits within the novel? There's someone giving there's about the history of Israel. There are these kind of digressions, right?
Yeah, I think that sounds familiar. It's been about a year since I finished reading it, so it's a little bit on the hazier side. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff about like scholarship and like history of Israel scholarship, because those are like the areas of these two guys that they're in. So yeah, there's like some scholarly, like interesting kind of stuff in it too. Yeah.
I will also say that we will put these lists of books into the show notes of the episode. So if you want to go back and refer to them,
quick reference.
Yeah, we'll have our own lists in there. My number 2 is this book called Chaotic Good by Lee Klein. And Lee is an incredible writer who I really just discovered his fiction writing. I had followed him on Twitter for many years, but had not picked up his books. I'd known him actually as a translator. He had translated Horatio Castellanos Moya's book called Revulsion about Thomas Bernhard. And he had won a big award for that. But his fiction writing is like extremely up my alley. And the sort of like plot summary of this book is about a guy who's a dad traveling to a fish show in New York. And that's
like
basically
PH?
the PH,
okay,
jam band.
Yeah.
And he had, the title is obviously from like Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, I was gonna
Chaotic
say.
Good.
Yeah.
And he had written another book called Neutral Evil.
Oh yeah.
But this book it really has nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons. So really it is about a fictionalized version of himself. And I really related to the style of writing, and also just the way it reminded me a bit of like Knausgaard's style of like it's novelization, but it's first person. And I'll want to read a little bit that sort of gives you a flavor of the writing, but also tells you like what kind of story he's writing here. So this is from page 48. He says, since then until now, the first weeks of 2020, thumbing this out on my phone while I take the early train, I've been feeling like I can't even commit to keeping at it and doing it for its own sake. The standard palliative justifications, all the talk about books and writing, immersion in related news and activities as though it were some religious sect. The problem being that I'd thought of it as a religious practice, which has nothing to do with the practices of publishing, confronting the challenges of no longer being all that young, not being representative of a place or a type of person, and writing in a style not of interest to those interested in experimental prose, but also not accessible or formulaic enough to please readers accustomed to conventional narrative. On top of that, the stories I wrote weren't stories so much as static opportunities for digressive associative rumination. And I really liked that phrase, as that's sort of what I'm interested in most right now, is not like your standard novel, but static opportunities for digressive associative rumination. And
That's
this
kind
is
of like
just
what your book is, feels like, Matt, a little bit.
right.
Yeah.
You can see why I'm interested in this.
Totally.
But his is a very unique, point of view. And like, what else is a novel but like a chance for you to give your point of view in the world,
Mhm.
or to share a story that is, sui generis, like unique. And I really loved this book. I want to go back and read his other books. He's got another one coming out this year. We got to get him on the show, Dave.
Oh, cool.
He's
I see
really
he's
great.
like an Iowa Writers Workshop graduate. I've just Googled him.
Yeah, but like I was saying earlier, most writers don't make their money from creative writing, right? They have a day job, have an office job. And so there is some of that struggle, of like how to be a father, how to be a working man, but also like fulfill some of your creative urges in life. So highly recommend it. If you like the kind of fiction that I do, you will like this book, Chaotic Good. Lee Klein.
Excellent. Wonderful.
All right.
You got a top read of the
Final
year?
Final round.
I think in the
His
spirit
isn't
of
ranked though. That's fine.
Not ranked.
Joke.
In the spirit of the podcast, I should probably go for the Instructions by Adam Levin, because I'd be remiss to not talk about it. And you've both read it, and it came up. For those listening who aren't familiar with their concavity law, it comes up in the very first podcast you did, where you discuss, along with Sergio de la Pava, I think, comes up, and other sort of should we say founding texts of the podcast. So I've been meaning to read it for ages and ages and ages, and obviously, I had the sense that it was a readable 1,000-page book. It wasn't, like Infinite Jest.
It's not like Infinite Jest or something.
But obviously, still, you're like, I should probably take a couple of weeks off work to, do justice to this, and also timely, because I think the Bar Mitzvah edition is sort of coming out this year, so that's kind of far.
I think this year is what Adam said.
But so I'll have to buy a second sort of decoy copy.
Me too.
But so obviously it's hard. How can you summarize your thoughts on like this like beast of a novel? But I guess for those who are listening who don't know about it, it's told from the perspective of are we going to say 8-year-old?
Is he 11 or 12?
Okay.
This feels like my instinct. I reread it last year, but that's what my memory is giving me right now.
Should we say a sophisticated young person? A sort of precociously talented.
He's very precocious, yeah. Hyper precocious, yeah.
Who is Jewish, but I think doesn't attend a Jewish school, has been expelled from various Jewish schools, and is now attending a sort of
several, yes.
Yeah. And
often for like acts of violence and acts of like insubordination, or like borderline like blasphemy, I guess you could say.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess you could say a psychological term which was once leveled at me, and that I think also applies to the main characters, that he perhaps has oppositional defiance, I think we could call it.
Yes,
So
right.
problems with authority, being told what to do, and he
Definitely
perhaps
true.
has a messiah complex as well, where, you know, in a
He
clever
certainly
way,
does, yeah.
the book toes the line between, is he or isn't he the Messiah? You know, it sort
Yeah.
of holds its cards close to its chest until the end, and possibly beyond
Yeah.
the end, as to whether or not he is, you know, a Messiah figure. But he is, so he's sort of
Yeah.
attending school. He's been put in this kind of restrictive cage-like bit of punitive, essentially prison within the school for disruptive children.
Yes.
And is sort of surreptitiously assembling some kind of army as a side
Yeah.
hustle, or during school hours as well. And there's this kind of text which he is writing, which is about, I guess there's kind of religious stuff, but it's also like a sort of handbook, terrorist's handbook of how to assemble a makeshift weapon from a discarded
penny gun.
soda bottle, a penny gun, exactly. And there's various antagonists within the novel, like the sort of bureaucratic administrator, Jocks, and Boy Star, who is the kind of
Boy Star,
pop star,
Justin
teen
Bieber,
pop idol.
YouTube
Yeah, exactly.
Star.
And he is due to perform later in the week at a kind of pep rally for the Jocks, for their because they've got a big basketball game coming up, I think. And it's just like, you know, it probably gets compared to Infinite Jest a lot, but it's its own thing, and it's completely unique and brilliant and compelling and hilarious as well. Really funny.
It's so funny. Yeah.
And one of the amazing things about it to me is like the whole thing is really set in like 4 days. Like,
it's a very short time span. I mean, there's like flashbacks and stuff, but like the action of the book is
the
very
action
tight.
of the book is like within a week. And
there's a romance story too, as well, with a Gentile girl that Gurion Ben-Judah Maccabee falls in love with hard. And his feelings about if she's Jewish or not and things like that. His parents are quite compelling characters too. Like his father's like a defense lawyer, I think, and his mother was in the IDF, Israeli Defense Force. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on about religion and Israel, and I think it's kind of maybe Adam's way of like deconstructing his upbringing a little bit and how he squares himself in relationship to the religion that he was, you know, sort of the community that he was raised with. And it's great. I enjoyed it the second time a lot too.
There's one sentence I picked out which I think relates to, you said there's this kind of love story going on, and so there's a line in the novel, it says, along with perfect justice and the end of death, being near her was the simplest thing I had ever wanted, which is a kind of a nice line, I think.
That's really cute.
I was just going to say, it's funny how, you know, we didn't talk about our lists in advance and plan these things, and yet this like through line of Judaism and like rabbinical studies in Israel is like probably the third or fourth book that we've mentioned that has this kind of overlap. It's just coincidental, I would say, but
so
and also
highly
like
erotically charged fiction and Judaism are the two themes of our episode today.
There's probably some more, but some violence in there for sure, and like some humor, so all kinds of other themes too. But
I would say, like, for the instructions, the climax of that novel is one of the most memorable climactic scenes in like all of literature. I think it's really like long and extended as well, so there's a good payoff to that book. It is very formidable and intimidating looking, but it is much more forgiving when you get into it than you might think at first blush.
Okay, Dave, you're up next.
Okay, probably my most favorite or close to it favorite read of the year was by Benjamín Labatut, called The MANIAC. And this is a writer that I had not heard of before this year, at least as far as I can like really remember. And I want to give a shout out to a listener of the show named Cameron Waller, who is from my same hometown, from Kelowna. We've never met before, but he has become an agent at Penguin Random House this year in Toronto. So he moved from Kelowna to Toronto in the last year. And he sent me an email earlier this year that was like, hey, I got this new job. I got this book that you and Matt have to read. I think you'd love it. I'm sending it to you. Like, what's your address? And I was like, cool. And I took this book with me to Ireland this summer, and I read it in a very short amount of time and was so compelled by it. It is basically like a history, like a novelized history of the 20th century in like math and physics, like the biggest heavy hitters in those fields. It mostly follows John von Neumann, who came to be like a very important figure in the Manhattan Project. So it follows kind of like these characters. They're like these big like mathematical discoveries, and then a lot of the characters end up on the Manhattan Project. And then the book gets into stuff about AI at the end, Matt, which I know that you're very interested in, and particularly this one AI program called AlphaGo, which was made to play the game Go. And there's this whole bit at the end that's kind of like in the appendix about this South Korean Go master Lee Sedol, who ends up playing a series of matches against AlphaGo. And it also mentions this documentary about this. So I was reading and I was like, you know, I'm really into like strategy games and high level competition and with those and all that stuff. And so it mentions the documentary, and I like immediately went and watched the whole documentary like that night in one sitting, and just became obsessed by like this whole stuff about Go and AI and
Board games? Who knew? Dave Laird?
I know, right? Exactly. So this like hit a lot of buttons for me. This book.
Do you play Go? Have you played it?
I've never played Go. I have no idea how to play it, other than like what I've learned from this book and the documentary.
So this was going to be on my list, but I haven't finished it yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I read his first book, When We Cease to Understand the World, which I think also won the Pulitzer Prize or won something big.
Yeah, maybe
I'm getting it mixed.
Maybe not the Pulitzer, but I think is really well regarded. I would
well
really like
received,
to read it. Yeah.
You didn't read that one first?
I've not read that one. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's very similar, I would say, in its themes and structure. And,
Yeah.
there's a lot in there about famous physicists and scientists. And that's basically the whole novel. Like, is it a novel? Like, I love these sort of hybridized works that are like, it's hard to tell really what's fiction and what is embellishment or just straight up documentary.
Totally.
Just well structured documentary in a way.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have the trappings of an academic book. Like it doesn't have like footnotes and chapter headings and stuff. Like it is told like a novel.
Yeah. And it doesn't get too heavy into like mathematical computation and like particle physics in a way that like, someone who has no background on that would be just like, wow, this is boring,
Yeah. It's a little bit actually like the Lipsky book, a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Anyways, the Go, I had one little anecdote about it, which was I had this interest in it back when I first discovered the Wallace L listserv, because the guy who ran it was also like super into playing Go.
Oh, cool.
It was a guy named Dan Schmidt, who was a video game designer, and I'd never heard of this game. Like growing up, I didn't know anyone. We played like chess, checkers, maybe Pente. Have you ever heard of Pente?
No.
But I'd never played Go, and that it was through him that I discovered it. I mean, I do have an interest in chess, medium interest, and like not strong, heavy chess player and competitor. Yeah. Like probably not even that good, but I'm more interested in it than like maybe any other board game.
Yeah.
And then it was just surprising to me that there were so many other people really into Go, and that like you would need a fucking computer to play it. Like it looks as simple as like checkers almost, but
it's got like a lot of pieces. Like you did need quite a large board, and there's like a lot of spots that you can put it's just one colored rock, either black or white, right?
Is it black or white, which is like binary, right? Like that's why computers I think are good at processing it, is there's a binary code to it. It's either black or white, on or off.
And it's kind of like it seems like a territorial domination game, so you aim to have more territory covered, like surrounding your opponent's
defensive strategy too. Yeah.
But yeah, this book was great. So check out on Instagram Cameron's Bookshelf. That's Cameron's like Bookstagram, and he's posting great stuff on there all the time too. So now that he's like a literary agent at Penguin Random House, he's sent us a few other emails too about like, hey, I got a book for you, check it out. So that's really cool. So thank you to Cameron, appreciate it. Matt, how about you? You got a final book for us from the year?
My final book
2023.
is this book, Day's Work, by Chris Batchelder, I think it's Batchelder, and Jennifer Habel, and they are a married couple.
Oh, cool.
And this book was published by Norton. It came out a few months ago, and it is exactly up my alley. It's sort of mostly about Herman Melville and Moby Dick.
Oh, then it would be, yes.
But it's also told in the style of like almost like a David Markson novel, like very short paragraphs, all broken up.
This book was written just for you, I think.
Pretty much.
And others, but yeah.
I absolutely love it. And it's written, like I say, in that very sort of dry, descriptive, short sentences. But there is a lot about their home life, their marriage as a couple. It's interesting to see like a couple writing a book together.
Yeah.
Like, what does that look like? Like, who's talking right now? Like, is it the husband or the wife? And they try to make it clear most of the time, like, oh, my husband said this, or my wife did this today. But all of it also takes place during COVID, sort of stuck at home, going down these rabbit holes of the biggest sort of Melville biographer is a guy named Herschel Parker. Like, if you know anything about Melville studies, like that dude is the man.
Okay.
And he has this pretty active blog, or did for many years, post everything about Melville that he could find on there. And so a lot of the book is them sort of taking issue with that shit. So and calling him out in some ways, and doing their, comparing it to other, so much has been written on Melville. And when I was preparing for this episode, I went and looked the book back up on Amazon, because I was actually recommending it to Stephen Moore. And I noticed Herschel Parker had written a review of the book on Amazon, which is pretty scathing. And, they did not consult him at all before they published this. And in the book, most of the time, he's just referred to as the biographer. And only in the acknowledgments of the book do they say, oh, the biographer, we want to acknowledge him. He's invaluable to this book, Herschel Parker. But the little bits of anecdotes, the little bits of trivia about Moby Dick and Melville in here are just fucking fantastic. Cool. And, they drop in all kinds of other literary references, all kinds of stuff about original research and American literature. And like I say, the style of it is what makes it for me. That book is just, I had followed Chris Batchelder's story, or his career. When it first came out, he had a book called Bear v. Shark that was sometimes compared to Wallace. And I read it and I thought it was okay. I didn't really keep up with his career that much until this book came out, and I saw anything about, like, I love books about Moby Dick. Anything like that, I will pick up and read. And I just so happened to be like, holy shit, this is like a David Markson style book about Moby Dick. And so that was like catnip to me, and I absolutely love it. Either of you heard of this book?
No, I haven't. Is it a necessary prerequisite to read Moby Dick to enjoy this book, would you say?
You haven't read Moby Dick?
I still haven't read Moby Dick.
All right, my new number one is Moby Dick by Herman Melville.
Have you read Moby Dick, Ben?
I haven't.
Yeah, okay. So like,
Dave, me and you, resolutions
really
for 2024.
Intimidating to me. It's like kind of like always on the back burner. Like, I should read that book, but like I don't really want to.
Dude, it is so different than what your expectations are of that book. Yeah. And I guarantee you, everyone who I know who has read it in adulthood is like, holy shit, that book was funny, accessible, not what I thought it would be. And it is not like some dusty old book from the 1800s. It very much reads like there's comedy in it, there's humor. It is not a hard book to read at all.
That's helpful.
It is absolutely a requirement to read.
Yeah, I know. Okay, good. Well, that helps.
Did you ever see the movie On Golden Pond? Do you know that? I'll get back to that. Go ahead.
I have not seen that.
No, I haven't read Moby Dick, but I tell you what, I have read Bear vs. Shark by Chris Batchelder, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
What did you think? You liked it?
Can I use a Matt Bookerism?
Tell us more. It's like
Just all right for me, dog. 'Cause, which I think you've retired
Please
that
do.
you used to say
Yeah.
that more, and
It's
it
just
seems
all
to have
right
been
for me,
dropped.
dog.
It's
Yeah.
just all right for me,
I need to
dog.
bring it back.
But
Just all right
yeah,
for
so
me,
I
dog.
agree with you that like I think it was fine, and it felt like file under kind of slightly Don DeLillo-ish kind of type stuff. But you've piqued my interest with Day's work, so I feel like I should give Batchelder another go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds cool.
I mean, obviously, if you're a fan of Melville or Moby Dick, you will like this better. I think. I brought up On Golden Pond. It's Jane Fonda, and her father Henry Fonda plays this crotchety old man, and she's bringing her stepson and new husband to meet her parents, and he's sort of interrogating him as this old man, and he's like, "Your son's never read Treasure Island," and he sends him up to bed with a copy of Treasure Island. That's how I sort of feel like.
Right now, about
Your
Moby
co-host has never read Moby Dick. I'm just going to send you up to bed with a copy of it right now.
Moby Dick was
It's really good.
It was famously, what was it, like only 500 copies were ever printed in Melville's own lifetime, and it was a complete failure
Oh,
at
really?
publication, and he never lived to see its success. Really, is that right, Matt?
Right.
So heartbreaking.
He basically quit being a writer and moved to New York and became a customs inspector, and he stopped writing. He did publish a few things later in life, like a weird poem, but he died, not as a famous writer
Obscurity.
at all.
Wow.
And it was, not until after he died in the early 1900s was his reputation sort of resurrected as a, what we would call now as a classic. But at the time, it was not considered. It was like some adventure bullshit novel about the South Pacific and whaling or something. It was like,
this happens to so many writers. It's really an unfair industry.
yeah.
You know.
I mean, even Faulkner, in a way, there's a famous story. What's the critic? Irving Howe is the one who put together the portable Faulkner, and Faulkner himself was considered like a regional, if you're just interested in the American South. But it was Irving Howe, who was, a New York Jewish intellectual who really championed Southern writers, including Faulkner, as being like representative of the American voice. But I mean, Moby Dick, there's graphic novel versions. There's all these different versions, public domain. Anyone can sort of illustrate it. But the writing of it is just so freaking great and hilarious. I probably reread that book at least twice, and I would reread it again. Starting with he starts on land, right? Like trying to find a boat to get onto. They get on the boat, and then you're on page 200 by the time they're even at sea, right? And I've did one rereading where we just started then, when you actually meet Ahab,
into the action,
right? But I mean, the first part is fantastic, and I could just reread that first 200 pages, but when you actually meet Ahab and you're on the water, out at sea, no land in sight, it's then the good shit starts.
Okay.
It's fantastic, man. I love that book. So, anyways, Day's Work, Chris Batchelder. That was my number one.
Cool.
We're at about 90
Awesome.
minutes, so
Yeah.
I feel like that was pretty good. If we had done it, do you want to do your honorable mentions? You want to throw in a few extra titles there, Ben? Do you have a few others on your list?
Yeah.
Just in 2 minutes.
Yeah. So Last Samurai, Helen DeWitt, which again is one that comes up in our circles,
nice
and such a good book. Such a good book.
I
Very readable. I think it looks kind of formidable from the outside, and it's actually
it does. Yeah.
And it's kind of stories within stories within stories. There's a lot of storytelling going on, sort of micro stories within the novel.
Yeah.
And there's another theme of our conversation. There's a kind of precocious young child who is a sort of polyglot genius, and is learning ancient Greek so they can read the Odyssey, I think, in its original.
In the original.
And
how old's that character? 11 or something?
Younger, I think, even younger than that. Yeah.
Younger,
and then there are these stories being told within the novel that are about people that you think are real people. And there was one about maybe a scientist, And I was convinced it was real, and I Wikipedia'd it, and there was just no trace of this. And she'd written it so convincingly. I was like, I'm sure this just sounds so real. Like this person must have existed, never existed. Like the only trace of the name on the internet is like traces back to the novel, The Last Samurai on Google. So that was amazing. I'm glad I finally got around to that.
I was worried that was going to be the case in the MANIAC, which is what I was just talking about. But then I like did, a deep dive Wikipedia thing after I finished the book, and I was like, okay, these are all real people. Cool.
Yeah.
This guy's like the father of computing, basically.
Yeah. And I would put in a plug for Lee Constantinu's book, The Last Samurai Reread, which I found really accessible and added a lot to my appreciation of that book. So I learned a lot from Lee Constantinu's reading of the Last Samurai. It's a fantastic book.
I'm keen to read that book, and I know just from without reading the book that she had a terrible time at publication, and she thought she was owed money from her publisher, but then she got like a big bill from her publisher, and it was actually the other way around, that she for some reason owed her publisher a huge amount of money. This Tom Cruise film, The Last Samurai, came out around the same time, so that kind of ruined the publicity of it. It had nothing to do with that. And there was a typesetting issue where, because there's quite a lot of sort of kanji Japanese stuff in the novel, and that was all ruined on first printing or so. So there was like a calamity, a comedy of errors.
Debacle,
which
I remember looking into that. Yeah.
Was it published by Miramax Books, or like Harvey Weinstein?
Yes.
Oh, really?
I think it was.
Yeah, it was a Harvey Weinstein issue. Yeah.
Oh, well.
Anyways,
and I would give a shout out for The Inquisitor's Manual by Antonio Lobo Antunes, which is a Portuguese kind of book in the modernist tradition about a deposed minister in a decaying Portugal, sort of during and after the Carnation Revolution in the 70s, which I didn't know anything about, but is, there was a kind of fascist government, I think, and then there was kind of a left-wing military coup to remove that government that brought its own problems, and then eventually Portugal transitioned into democracy, but it's kind of set around that period. And his name's kind of come up as like a potential Nobel Prize winner in future years. So I was kind of keen to dive in, and that was really good. I'd recommend that.
Cool.
I think I own this book, and I've read another Antunes book that is really short. Is this really short book?
No, this is about 400 pages. This one.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the one that I read was like 50 pages. It was a very short. Anyways, keep going.
Definitely wasn't a favorite, but I read Mason and Dixon by Thomas Pynchon, and nearly killed me in the process. Have either of you two read it?
Looking book. I have not read that one. No.
I mean, I read it like when I was in college when it came out, and it was, written in a sort of obscure, obsolete vernacular.
Friscolating dust flight.
Very hard to follow some of just like what the fuck is going on. And some of it is just too obscure for me. Like I'm interested in the idea of it, but the like you say, the actuality of the reading is pretty just not pleasurable for me, dog. So
I've had Against the Day on my shelf for like 15
Oh, that's a different
years.
beast. That's a good beast.
Yeah, okay.
You should have read that one.
Well, I've not read Mason and Dixon either, so
you can skip Mason and Dixon for all I care.
Okay.
It's funny.
First couple pages are good.
In the Pynchon community, there are people that swear by Mason and Dixon, and some people, more Against the Day minded. So, as a sidebar, do you ever do that thing where you get a secondhand book either from a charity shop or online, and there's someone, not in a creepy way, but there's someone's name in the front cover because it's the previous owner, and I always try and track down who that person is and find them on LinkedIn and say like, what's this? How did this book end up in my hands? Like, did you read it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Like, what? When did you read it? Like, and I've had sort of limited success with that, where the reason I say that is because there was someone's name in Mason and Dixon, and I tried to add them on LinkedIn, but they never accepted the invite. Absolutely fine, their prerogative. They don't have to accept it if they don't want to. That's where it ends, if they. But I for The Savage Detectives by Roberto Bolaño, I had the most unedifying conversation where I found the person whose name was in the front, and I added them on LinkedIn. It took them about 6 months, and they accepted the invitation. And I was like, what did you read it? What do you think? And she was like, yeah, I guess I can't really remember anything about it. It's like, you can't remember anything about The Savage Detectives. It's a crazy book. And I didn't want to push and be like, you're going to have to give me a better review than that. That's not acceptable. Give me 2,000 words by Monday or whatever. But so I wouldn't necessarily recommend
to actually track those people down. Yeah. Okay. Doing that.
Yeah.
I like that you do that though. That's an interesting little story.
Yeah.
Like
I'll continue. I'll update you if I ever have better successes than what I've had currently with it. But yeah.
Cool. Nice.
Is it pronounced Balan or Beelan? Because I want to do it right.
I say Beelan.
Beelan. So obviously
the author says Beelan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, the Beelan deck was great, obviously, and congrats, Matt, on publishing it.
Thank you.
I actually can't believe. Obviously, I can believe because it's great. But you shared recently that Jonathan Lethem mentioned in his year-end highlights, which is amazing. So it's clearly spreading its tentacles and finding an audience, which is fantastic.
It is.
One question for you, Matt. Because I'm kind of interested in Nobel Prize winners. You mentioned Pearl S. Buck in the book, and as a kind of underrated laureate. So, is she any good, and should we read her? And what should we read? Because she never comes up really. She's sort of a forgotten name, isn't she?
Right. Yeah. I have a bunch or several of her books, I would say. But The Good Earth, that's it. The Good Earth she won the Nobel Prize based on that book. And I guess there's a couple of cheeky things about that reference, which is that right before that in the book, the sentence before, I say something sort of extolling the virtues of experimental nonlinear fiction. And then boom, hit you with The Good Earth is also deserves a Nobel Prize, which is very much a traditional linear sort of novel. The other thing is the main character of The Good Earth is a Chinese person named Olan, O-Lan. And there's a mention in the book of there's a lot in the book about this guy named Ogden Mills, and I'm sort of free associating with Olin Mills, which if you grew up in the United States in the 1980s and you had your family portrait taken at the mall, it was usually at a studio called Olin Mills.
Oh, really?
So there's this connection between in between Ogden Mills over here, who was sort of the founder of San Francisco Airport, and then The Good Earth over here, Olan. There's Olan Mills. I was just sort of Ducks Newburyport, riffing on words and poetic names and things. So that's totally bizarre. But I actually really like that book. And, it reminds me a bit of anything that's written about really poor people in distant lands long ago. And, John Berger's Pig Earth is like this. Some other books that we've mentioned on the show, I sort of in this vein of almost communist, right? Where it's the stories of the poor people were not told. The workers were, the stories were written by the rulers or the people who were interesting lives. And I was more interested in the commoner's life. And, what is it like the person who's out picking in a field right now? What is their life like? And that's sort of what The Good Earth is about. And there's this sort of resonance where I try to bring it up in the last line of my book, where it's the real earth. And down underneath all the concrete that we've built on this earth is still the good earth, the real earth somewhere. So that is an important book to me in my sort of literary journey of reading it. So I don't like it when people shit on things that I love, that's a book that I love, The Good Earth.
And I need to read that too.
Yeah, I do too. And I don't think Jonathan Lethem observed it himself, but he referenced in another review of the book that I really loved whoever the reviewer was, they made the Twin Peaks connection, that when the narrator of the book is dictating to their kind of their assistant, and there's the kind of digressions on AI. It's a bit like Diane, the dictaphone of Diane from Twin Peaks. I love that connection. I don't know if you had that in mind, Matt, when you were writing it, or
I did not at all.
Okay.
Yeah, Jonathan Lethem made that connection, and I was like, huh. I haven't seen the new Twin Peaks. I haven't thought about Twin Peaks. I do like Fire Walk with Me a lot, but I'll have to go watch it now because I had no idea that was even a thing in Twin Peaks. So
yeah, like right off the hop, right? With Agent Cooper, just driving and dictating.
I just didn't even remember. I just didn't make the connection.
Can I keep going with the honorable mentions, or are we?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm having a great time. So okay, great, amazing.
Yeah, no, keep going.
So it feels weird putting Ulysses in an honorable mentions because like.
Fuck it.
But
wonderful. Like,
that's probably where it would land for me too, had I read that book. Yeah.
So I finally got around to reading Ulysses, which I think we're around the centenary of. I think it was 1922 that it was first published. So I kind of probably missed the actual, but anyway, like got close to it. And I read it alongside a really helpful guide that I would recommend to anyone reading it for the first time, called Ulysses Unbound by Declan Kybird, I think is the author. And it sounds quite dry because it just gives a kind of chapter by chapter summary followed by sort of themes and how the Gilbert schema kind of links up with the novel. But it's incredibly helpful because it is a really difficult book, and Declan will say something like, oh, and this piece of paper had a horse racing tip on it, and then the person he throws it in the bin, but then someone picks it up and then they win money on the Gold Cup and you're like, yeah, I never would have realized that if you hadn't explained it to me, and that's quite important in some ways. So so that really enhanced my reading. So I did like chapter of Ulysses, chapter of Declan's book explaining it. So I kind of put the hard yards in, and it was, it's obviously a fantastic. It's the text for the mega novel, isn't it? So in some ways,
So, how long did it take you to read those together?
Ooh, good question. I think, do you two do that thing with big books where you're like, I'm definitely going to finish this book. I'm like halfway through, so like it would be absolute travesty if I gave it up now. Yeah. But I am going to fit in some smaller books to kind of get some momentum back. So like I think there was probably a bit of that going on during the reading of Ulysses. But and there's a book of critical essays written by one person, sort of micro essays, called Multiple Joyce, which is, I can't remember the author, but I've got that lined up this year as a kind of like afterburner kind of, let's read some kind of critical stuff on it. So I've got that lined up. And I also, when I'm having bits of downtime at work, I kind of want to do the audiobook of Finnegan's Wake this year as well. So I'm having a bit of a Joycean project going on.
Yeah, okay. Renaissance, yeah. Cool.
I would give one comment on Ulysses, which is I had a chance to take a class on Ulysses when I was an undergrad, and I didn't, and I regret it. So if there's anyone listening to this who has the chance ever to take a class on just one novel, or particularly on Ulysses, do it, or else you'll regret it the rest of your life.
Amazing.
I totally agree.
Voice of experience. I bet that'd be a great book to take as a class, right? Like that's how you understand the book and have the momentum to finish it. Yeah.
My university did that thing of like, we're just going to do a whole semester and the novel is just Ulysses is just it for the whole semester. And I agree with you, Matt. I wish I'd kind of like bargained with the history department to let me take that. I did some other credits in other departments, but I never thought to do that. It was probably too intimidating at the time. And it took me like a decade to get around to it at my own pace. But I read A Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, which just won the Booker Prize.
Rachel finished this like yesterday.
What did Rachel think of it?
She found it to be utterly devastating, terrifying, horrific in every way, but like fantastic. But she feels like she's like really scarred from this book from how plausible the like fascist government situation in Ireland that it sets up is.
It's really provoked quite a lot of debate, I think, running the gamut from the kind of people being crossed that it appears to be a sort of wokey left-wing pick for the prize, and like how dare they, because it's just a flash in the pan kind of thing that is going to be forgotten about in years to come. And people on the other side of the spectrum going like it's incredibly sort of relevant and timeless. And it's that Margaret Atwood quote of all of these things have happened somewhere at some point, so I've kind of put it all together, but none of this is speculative. This has all happened before somewhere. And I there's a Booker Prize podcast which is like run by the official Booker people, and one of the hosts, because they had read the shortlist and they were kind of discussing, just the hosts of the podcast, they were discussing what they thought of the shortlist, and one of the hosts was like, I just don't buy the premise of this book, it would never happen in Ireland. And it's like, I profoundly disagree with you that obviously not just Ireland but anywhere, but like definitely in Ireland it could happen. And it it makes you think. It's one of the I said earlier that like books read you as well, and it is that thing of you're reading it and you're thinking, well, what would I do if there was sort of, what am I doing, are there the stirrings of fascism right now, and what am I doing to stop it, and how will I feel if they came for me and knocked on my door, and all that kind of stuff. So it's a really without directly doing it, the book is obviously posing the question to the reader, like, how would you feel? How are you going to feel when it goes down like this? And it's always going down like this somewhere at some point. So I wasn't in love. The prose style wasn't necessarily like my favorite type of prose style, and it's quite poetic. It's quite the inner lives of the characters. There's a lot of kind of internality to the narration, but it's undoubtedly a great book, and I would recommend that, and I enjoyed that. And I also I try and read the Booker Prize winner every year now, and I try and read it early to kind of get, sometimes you've absorbed so much discourse that you're like, I feel like I've read it without having read it. Yeah, so I read The Seven Moons of Marley Almeida as well, which is by Shehan Karuna Tilaka, who won it last year, which is also a really good novel set during the civil war, I guess, happening in Sri Lanka in the late 80s and early 90s. And that is also, and he's quite heavily influenced by like Kurt Vonnegut type stuff. So it's got a kind of, it's that thing of like playfulness mixed with the awfulness of historical reality kind of coming together. So he wears some of the awfulness quite lightly, because it's like, this is so dreadful that the only way I'm going to get you to read this book and we're going to get through it is, if I'm a bit playful with it. But it packs a punch. So that would also recommend that.
Cool.
And then just a few more. Self-Portrait in Green by Marie Ndiaye. So I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but her surname is Ndiaye. And that was really good. Very short, novella length. Lots of stuff about kind of identity and blackness, I think, as well. That was really excellent. And then Nothing Special by Nicole Flattery, which is set during kind of Andy Warhol's Factory era, about a young... Did you know that Andy Warhol did this novel where he basically just recorded people, it's
called I have that book.
And it was just like, without people really knowing they were being recorded, it was just straight dialogue of like people socializing at the factory or whatever, and then he just transcribed the dialogue as it's written on the page, I think, like as it happened. So there's no editing for like intelligibility. And obviously these people
it's really not readable. I didn't find, it's an interesting experiment. I like the idea of it and I bought it, but it's not interesting. That like the idea of it is interesting, but the reading of it is terrible. I bought this
Sounds
book.
kind of unethical too.
Nicole Slattery. I bought this book for my wife for Christmas, partly because I wanted to read it. So I expect after she's done, then I'll pick it up. Sort of like what Dave's talking about.
Yeah.
But it's
Cool.
like a bad mother, right? Like what else is going on in this book?
Yeah. So the principal character is hired as a typist, I think, in the factory to transcribe the tapes to make this novel. And she's living with her mum. I read it a while back, so I can't remember too much, but it's got a kind of Mad Men kind of flavor to it. And it's just kind of, if you've got any interest in Warhol and the factory, it's kind of about like being on the fringes of that, but also about sort of loneliness and finding connection in New York in the period. And I thought that was really good, so would recommend that. And then just finally, I caught up with a few Annie Ernaux short novellas, because I'm just sort of trying to read my way through Annie Ernaux. So I think I read one called Exteriors and maybe A Man's Place, which is about her father. And she's just got such a good kind of eye for dissecting French society and just watching people and how they behave and class structures and things like that. So I'm sure I'll be enjoying Annie Ernaux's output for many years to come, and just kind of eking it out bit by bit, because I want to make it last. But she's a great author.
Yeah, I bought a couple of hers in 2022, I think, and I don't remember the titles because they all kind of blend together, but they're similar in memoiristic novels, with some like social commentary mixed in. So I, I want to get back and read more. I saw David Herring was reading them all on Twitter. Like in 1 year, he read like everything she has in print, which is pretty ambitious.
Cool. Awesome, Ben. Thank you for your very robust list of reading in 2023. That's awesome.
Oh, one more, Dave.
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry. Didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just checking, and I was like, oh god, I've missed out The Uninhabitable Earth by Dave Wallace Wells. So I'll chuck that one in as my kind of non-fiction read for the year, which was just an incredibly sobering account of what will happen to us all if we continue to be pumping out greenhouse gases and all the rest of it. And what happens if we get to 2%, what happens if we get to 3%, what happens when we get to 4%, and just kind of playing out the various scenarios. And you did your great episode with David Lipsky. I feel like I should go on and read the Lipsky now, having read the Dave Wallace Wells, I think.
Yeah, it's big. Sounds like a big theme in all of our reading this year is climate change, climate crisis stuff. Yeah. Cool. I mean, not cool climate crisis, but cool. Thank you for your books. Appreciate it. I'll mention a couple of quick honorable mentions that I haven't already mentioned. I've mentioned quite a few, but I finally got around to reading Evan Dara's The Lost Scrapbook this year, which is another book that was like very hard for me to get as a Canadian, but I finally did it. Same book order, by the way, as
Magnetic Fields.
Magnetic Fields, yeah. I found it kind of mystifying and like very different from what I was expecting. Like it was very hyped to me.
It's super experimental.
It's pretty experimental, and it also is kind of a book where I was like, I don't really know what's happening until the end, and then I'm like, oh, okay.
It's some Aaron Brockovich type shit, like Poison in the Water. It's an environmentalist book.
Yeah, and so now I'm like, well, if I reread it, I think I would get a lot more out of it. Yeah. So maybe I'll do that down the line. But overall, quite enjoyable. And then another book I'll mention is Meiselman, The Lean Years by Avner Landis, who is a listener of the show. And this book was recommended to us by Christian Tabordo as like an office novel that came out around the same time as The Apology. And then he said he reached out to Avner and said like, hey, I just came out with a book that sounds similar to yours. And they had some good back and forth. So Avner sent that book to us, and I quite enjoyed it. It was great. Really funny, all the trappings of office life and people's egos and things like that, and old vendettas, and a lot of marital stuff and a lot of stuff about being a Jewish man in America. And it was a really nice time with that book as well. So those are my couple more honorable mentions. Matt, how about you?
So I want to mention a couple books. One is this book by Nick Voro called Conversational Therapy, Short Stories and Other Plays. And it's a bunch of very unique stories, one of which I will point out called Alligator Resort, about a resort full of alligators. It's really
Say what you see.
funny. And I really enjoyed that book by Nick Voro. This other book I want to mention, published by Corona Samizdat, called A Pastoral by Lee Thompson. These are both Canadian writers, by the way.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And they are the ones who published, Cult of the Cactus Boots. And I think this book I want to do like a whole episode on as well. I have a lot more to say about A Pastoral and Lee Thompson. Really phenomenal writing in that
Sweet.
book. The third book I'm going to mention is a nonfiction book called The Migrant Chef by Laura Tillman. And Laura Tillman is a journalist, writer in Mexico. And this is a biography of a chef in Mexico City named Lalo Guzman, something like Lalo. And he grew up extremely poor in Mexico, made his way to the United States, became, a sort of a line cook at a shitty restaurant in Florida. And, this is a long, long story about how he ended up becoming like a high end restaurateur. And his restaurant in Mexico City is called Maximo Bistro. And, this is one of the like great restaurants of the world. And, he grew up literally like picking vegetables. And like, how does a person like that, sort of like what I was talking about with the Good Earth, like end up succeeding? And this is a true story of that. So been meaning to write a review of this book. I haven't found the right place to really write about this book, but I would highly recommend it. Her previous book is also fantastic, which is about a horrific true crime. Maybe don't read that one if you have little kids, but
Thanks for that.
The Migrant Chef is heartwarming in a way, but also like sort of terrifying about United States immigration policy and why this guy ended up back in Mexico rather than in the United States. But a true story, great sort of reporting, in a book that probably should have got more attention. So that's my honorable mentions. Thanks for everyone for sticking with us. Like I said, we'll have these lists in the show notes. If you've made it this long, we're at 2 hours of recording.
You won't have to go back and like rewrite them down in case you missed doing that.
Yeah. Right. We've got it already written down for you, which you can get at concavityshow.com or greatconcavity.podbean.com. We will, like I say, have more to say about films and podcasts and music and other media on our bonus episode. So keep a lookout for that. Ben, any final thoughts? Dave, any final thoughts before we wrap up this year-end episode?
Yeah, a couple of final thoughts. I'd like you, both of you, to tell me how you feel about being OG literary podcast type people, where I think when I found your podcast, it really was kind of the only thing of its type available. And actually, in the last couple of years, maybe lockdown related, you've now got a Don DeLillo podcast and a Now Scarred podcast and a Jonathan Franzen podcast and various other ones.
Oh yeah.
And so how do you feel about, are you avid consumers of all of these other podcasts, and how do you feel about really sort of being there from the beginning and sort of kicking all that off?
I mean, I love all those other shows, the Volman as well. Beyond the Zero. I mean, there's a ton of them, and I mean, I think it's a great medium. The more, the merrier. I'm not competitive about it at all. I don't need any kind of credit for we did this. I mean, I think a lot of people hate our show, which is fine. Anytime you put something out there,
read our reviews.
Yeah, people are going to trash you if you write anything like a book. I look at some of these books that we've mentioned today. Ulysses has like 4-star rating on Goodreads. It's like, Gravity's Rainbow is like 3.9 star rating. It's like, okay, well then you go fucking write a masterpiece, and maybe then you'll give it 5 stars.
You guys seen that Instagram account Bad Reads Official,
Yeah.
where it just shows all like the 1-star reviews? It's very
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah, but in general, it's sort of absurd. But I like those other podcasts. I think, like I say, the more the merrier. One thing that is unique about our show, which does limit the number of episodes we can do, is that Dave and I have to agree on what to read next, and then actually read the book.
Yeah.
And a lot of those other shows, it's like, well, they've already read all of the Volman books, or they've already read all of the Franzen books and the
That's
John
true.
DeLillo books, whereas we're sort of branching out to read new stuff, and maybe hopefully stuff that doesn't get as much attention. But it's not one person's show. Like, it's a 2-person show.
Oh, yeah.
So we do have to agree, and sometimes we don't. So that slows us down in publishing new episodes. But I don't know. What do you think, Dave?
I've never really thought of this, Ben, before that we like started like this, I don't know, some kind of trajectory of like single author podcast before. That's a new concept to me. But I mean, if we had any hand in, interesting people in like making their own podcast about the writer they're excited about, that's really cool. Like I'm very happy if we were able to give any inspiration to anybody else. That's wonderful. And yeah, like the book community online has been such a lovely thing to be a part of, here, and like the way it's spread on Instagram and other places too, and Twitter. Happy to be here along for the ride for it. And I'm just like really thankful for people who've been with us for so long, like you, Ben, who like the lore of the show you mentioned earlier. That's hilarious. Yeah, so
I think
I mean,
it's a
we're not going
testament
anywhere.
well, that's good to hear, because I was going to make you promise, and then I thought that's not really appropriate, but you've done it for me, so I don't have to. But I think it's a testament to your show that, when you find a podcast and it's a kind of a mainstream interviews podcast type thing where it's like, I don't know, whatever. I can't think of an example. There's millions of them, right? Or have you heard of Off Menu podcast? Like, for example, where they get celebrities to talk about what meals they like, and it's like you flick through those ones. You flick through those ones, and you're like, oh, Carl McLaughlin's being interviewed. I'll check that one out. I want to listen to that one. I don't care about any of the other people. But the testament to your podcast is that I obviously had barely heard or not heard of any of these people for the first 50 shows that you did, and I was like, I'm with it. I'm going to listen to all of these because I'm going to learn about new people and new books and new perspectives. So you bring people along for the ride, I think, and it's you talk about the output can kind of get a bit slow down a bit because you've both got to agree, but I think that's a testament to the fact that you put a lot of research in and care into an episode. You don't just jump into an episode willy-nilly, and so it's quality, not quantity, and you're quality merchants.
And for the record, we're not paying Ben to say any of this, as far as I know. I didn't incentivize him to mention
funding all of his Patreon money back to him over the years.
But no, we really appreciate that. It's really, really kind of you to say.
Yeah, that's
and the lore of my Christmas and New Year's for the last 4 or 5 years have been making a cup of coffee and lying down on my sofa with a nice blanket and a notebook and listening to all your highlights for the year and making huge notes about what to look into for the next year. So it's really nice to be a part of it.
That's cool. That happens for me too with this episode, because Matt always talks about all these books I've never heard of, and I'm like, rad. Now I have a whole reading list for the next year, kind of thing.
Me too. I have tons of notes, and have not read most of what you guys have talked about. So
yeah.
I have more than enough books that I could read in a lifetime.
Yeah, that's true. Ben, where can people hit you up online? Are you on the internet? If people want to hit you up on LinkedIn, and if they found a book in a used bookshop with your name in it, where can they reach you?
I'd say just my email address is the best way if people want to email me, because I'm weirdly anonymous and pseudonymous online, where, I've kind of kept it on the down low on kind of locked Twitter accounts, which is actually then incredibly annoying when you want to interact with someone who doesn't follow you and you've sort of cut off the key element of interactivity on Twitter. But so ben.diamond@gmail.com if anyone wants to email me.
Cool.
Cool.
Would you be comfortable with me taking a screenshot of us talking right now for a future post, or would you like to keep your face anonymous on the internet too?
That's absolutely fine.
Sweet, we'll do that later. Matt, where can people reach us?
Concavity Show. Let's say we're mostly on Instagram, on email, but that's how we found Ben, was that he emailed us. So we do read and respond to every single email we get. So please reach out with your own recommendations or negative reviews. Don't put those on Apple Podcasts. Put those in an email to us. No, I'm kidding. Everyone's free to do whatever you want, but we do like getting emails. concavityshow@gmail.com. I think that's it, Dave.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, everybody. Hope you had a great 2023. We look forward to doing this again next year, and we wish you all a great year in reading. Stick around for the bonus episode dropping a couple weeks after this one for our year and other stuff. Thanks so much, Ben. It was great having you on. Really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
Catch me now as I sing into darkness. I thought to be extinct.
Trying to kind of hold his nerve and go down there and
Sorry, the fire alarm has just gone off in my house. Someone's like cooking upstairs, and just here, I'll mute myself.
What in the hell?
I'm at my in-laws right now because there's no children in this house, and their fire alarm just went off.
Jesus Christ!
They're cooking something in their oven, procs the fire alarm all the time. Sorry about that.
Whew.
Oh, there's the mute. I just found where the mic mute button is. Whoops. Anyways, we'll just edit that out. It's fine. I'll put that as the Easter egg, just loud. All right. So where were we? So the beige fudge, and then so the threesome doesn't go off as he planned.